What if the greatest villain in Christian history wasn't a villain at all? What if Judas Iscariot, the man whose name became synonymous with betrayal, was actually following orders not from the Sanhedrin, not from Satan, but from Jesus? What if the crucifixion wasn't a tragic consequence of betrayal, but a divine plan willingly orchestrated and carried out by the one disciple who understood it best? This isn't a blasphemous what if. It's written in a gospel buried for over 1,000 years, and it changes everything. Of course, such a claim isn't meant to be swallowed in one bite. It lingers unsettling, strange, just out of reach. So tonight, we take it slow. We walk through sand, through parchment, through silence and firelight. And we follow a name that has echoed for centuries, all the way back to the cave where Judas speaks again. You've heard his name before, probably in a whisper, probably followed by a wince. Judas, the betrayer, the one who kissed the Son of Man and then sold him for silver. You don't need a Bible to know that story. It's soaked into the floorboards of Western history. Painters captured the moment, the kiss, the silver, the guilt. Poets spat his name. Priests warned against his fate. Even language didn't spare him. A Judas became shorthand for traitor turncoat, false friend. But there's another version, quieter, stranger, and far more difficult to dismiss. In 2006, after centuries of silence, a crumbling leather-bound codex was brought into the light. It had survived grave robbers, smugglers, and the Sahara itself. When finally deciphered, its title struck like lightning: the Gospel of Judas. Not about Judas. By Judas, or at least told in his voice. A gospel that doesn't damn him, but honors him. A gospel where Jesus laughs not at the world, but at his other disciples. Where betrayal is not sin, but sacrifice. Where Judas is the only one who understands what must be done, and does it. Tonight we open that gospel. We won't just analyze it, we'll walk its halls, examine the walls it threatens to crack, and listen to the echoes it resurrects. We'll look at the church's response, the historical context, the hidden threads that suggest this story may not be as fringe as it sounds. And most of all, we'll ask the question that no one dared to ask out loud. What if the villain was the only one who truly obeyed? Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Because this is not a tale of heresy. It's a story about how easy it is to erase someone when they play a part we were never meant to understand. You begin in the sand. Not just any sand, but the parched, ochre-colored dust of Middle Egypt, where the wind speaks in hisses and the stones keep secrets far longer than parchment ever could. Somewhere near El Minya in the 1970s, a farmer digging for limestone stumbled across a buried chamber. It wasn't grand. No golden coffins or towering statuary. Just a weathered box tucked into the earth like a forgotten memory. Inside was a leather-bound codex, fragile, flaking, and utterly indecipherable to the man who found it. He had no idea he'd unearthed a text that would one day whisper in Judas's defense. But secrets don't like to come quietly. The codex changed hands many times in the following decades, bouncing between antiquities, dealers, black market smugglers, and neglected bank vaults. At one point, it was even stored in a freezer, not for preservation, but because no one knew what else to do with it. Its pages, written in Coptic, suffered deeply in the process. Mold, humidity, and neglect nearly erased them. Had it stayed buried another few years, the story of Judas the Savior might have disintegrated entirely. It wasn't until the early 2000s that serious restoration efforts began. The Maecenas Foundation for Ancient Art in Switzerland acquired the codex, and enlisted scholars to painstakingly piece it back together. The pages were brittle as burnt leaves. Some were missing, others were jumbled. But slowly, with careful translation and forensic reconstruction, the words emerged, and with them a shock. This wasn't another copy of Matthew or a lost letter of Paul or even a forgotten sermon. This was something else, something bold, unsettling, and ancient. A gospel, and not just any gospel. One that named its narrator not in accusation, but in revelation Judas Iscariot. Historically, the idea of alternate gospels is nothing new. Since the early centuries of Christianity, texts have surfaced, claiming to offer untold stories, hidden knowledge, or suppressed revelations. Most are dismissed quickly, either proven to be later forgeries or too fragmentary to consider. But this codex was different. Its language placed it around the 3rd or 4th century, old enough to matter. More importantly, its content bore the hallmarks of a very specific worldview, one that would make traditional theologians shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Gnosticism. But before diving into that particularly wild pool, it's worth pausing to consider the context of discovery itself. Egypt, oddly enough, has been the cradle for many such unearthings. In 1945, the Nag Hammadi Library, another collection of early Christian and Gnostic texts, was found just a few hundred kilometers from where this gospel lay hidden. It's almost poetic. The very deserts that once exiled these ideas are now the ones delivering them back into our hands. Still, the Gospel of Judas didn't burst onto the scene like a messiah. Its release in 2006 was cautious, wrapped in academic commentary and thick with disclaimer. National Geographic led the media charge, framing it as a fascinating curiosity rather than a theological revolution. Some scholars praised its insight. Others called it a Gnostic fantasy, heretical derivative, or both. And a few predictably just pretended it didn't exist. But it does exist. And in its crumbling pages, Judas doesn't hang himself in despair. He speaks. He reasons. He receives secret knowledge. Jesus calls him apart from the others and tells him things too dangerous to repeat aloud. And eventually Judas acts. Not with malice, not with regret, but with purpose. Of course, not everyone agrees on that reading. Some argue the text still damns Judas, just in a more complicated metaphysical way. They say the Gospel of Judas isn't a vindication, but a philosophical trap. Others claim that the translation itself might be skewed, that missing words, damaged grammar, or interpretive bias could have warped the meaning entirely. And then there's the lingering suspicion, was this gospel ever meant to be taken literally at all? That question, hovering like desert heat, still divides scholars today. But what can't be debated is this: the Gospel of Judas is real. It is ancient, and it paints a picture we were never meant to see. Already its very existence challenges the clarity of betrayal. If even one of the earliest Christian voices tells a different story, how many others were lost or silenced? The Church, of course, had a vested interest in keeping the Judas narrative simple. Betrayal is a powerful teaching tool. It feeds a clean dichotomy: good versus evil, loyalty versus treachery. But this gospel doesn't play along. It muddies the water. It whispers, what if Judas was the only one who understood what had to be done? That idea, that heresy of compassion, turns the whole passion story on its head. It doesn't erase the crucifixion. It recontextualizes it. If Judas obeyed Jesus, then the arrest wasn't a trap. It was choreography. And that changes more than just one man's legacy. It shifts the very ground of Christian theology. So we begin not with fire but with dust, with a box buried beneath limestone, with pages nearly lost to time and mildew, and with a name not shouted in accusation but whispered in wonder. The betrayer, or the chosen one. You don't read the Gospel of Judas the way you read the others. It doesn't walk you through parables or recount miracles or offer sermons on mountaintops. It doesn't give you nativity scenes or moral aphorisms or a warm, predictable arc of sin and salvation. It throws you into a strange world where Jesus laughs at his disciples, talks in riddles, and treats Judas as the only one who gets it. And that's your first clue this gospel wasn't trying to fit in. It was trying to challenge everything. Right away, the text strikes a different tone. Jesus doesn't come across as gentle or meek. He's cryptic, remote, almost alien. The other disciples, Peter, Matthew, the rest of the familiar crew, bumble around, asking questions, confused and frustrated, desperate for answers. Jesus dismisses them. Sometimes he scolds them outright. But when Judas speaks, Jesus listens. More than that, he smiles, and he shares. According to the gospel, Jesus pulls Judas aside and tells him the secret of the universe. Not in soft whispers, but in terms of cosmologies, archons, and hidden aeons, layers upon layers of divine structure that make the heaven of traditional Christianity look like a child's drawing. In this telling, the God worshipped by the disciples isn't even the true God. It's a lower being, a demiurge presiding over a corrupt physical world. And Jesus, he doesn't belong to this world at all. His essence is from a higher realm, and it's trapped in flesh. Here's where it gets dizzying. The crucifixion, according to this text, isn't a sacrifice to cleanse sin. It's an escape plan. Jesus wants to leave his physical body behind that mortal garment and return to the divine fullness. But he can't do it alone. He needs someone to help him, someone to turn him in, to start the chain of events that will lead to his death and his release. He needs Judas. And so with stunning calm, Jesus looks at Judas and says, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." It's one of the most mysterious and haunting lines in the entire manuscript. The man that clothes me. Not me, but the man, the body, the shell, the avatar. Judas isn't betraying Jesus. He's peeling back the illusion, helping him shed the skin that keeps him bound to this world. It's not treachery. It's obedience of the highest order. This idea is, of course, radioactive. In the canonical Gospels, Judas is the one who dips his bread and slips into the night. He's the one who sells Jesus for 30 pieces of silver and kisses him in the garden. And then, racked with guilt, he throws the money away and hangs himself. His story is short, violent, and morally simple. But the Gospel of Judas complicates everything. There's no suicide here, no remorse. Just dialogue, vision, revelation. This Judas isn't possessed by Satan. He's possessed by clarity. He acts not for silver, but for Jesus. And that turns the whole moral framework upside down. Of course, the Gospel never quite tells us what happens next. The manuscript ends abruptly, damaged, incomplete, cut off mid-thought, like a breath held too long. We never see Judas carry out the act. We never see Jesus arrested. Instead, we're left with a lingering moment, Judas alone watching the stars, preparing to do what he's been asked. And this is where the debates begin. Some scholars argue that the Gospel paints Judas as a hero, that he alone understands the cosmic plan, that he's exalted above the others. But others, with raised eyebrows and thick stacks of footnotes, suggest the opposite. That this gospel is a kind of metaphysical trap. That Judas thinks he's obeying but is actually being used. That Jesus is manipulating him in some grand cosmic irony. Then there are those who question the translation itself. Coptic, after all, is a tricky language, and the manuscript is fragmentary at best. Words like sacrifice and exceed, might carry multiple meanings. Some even argue that the tone of the text is satirical, a kind of divine mockery, not an endorsement. But even with these uncertainties, one thing is clear: this gospel is not like the others. It doesn't try to teach moral lessons. It doesn't want to comfort. It wants to destabilize, to shatter assumptions, and replace them with a vision so bizarre, so foreign, that it demands contemplation, even if it's ultimately rejected. And here's an obscure detail that often gets overlooked: the Gospel of Judas isn't structured like a narrative. It's not a story in the traditional sense. It's a dialogue. A private extended conversation between Jesus and Judas, layered with esoteric symbols, cosmic visions, and sharp rebukes of the other disciples. It reads more like a philosophical treatise than a biography. And that style, that's textbook Gnosticism, the kind of thinking we'll explore very soon. For now, though, it's worth letting the strangeness settle. Imagine being a first-century believer raised on stories of sin, redemption, and martyrdom, and suddenly someone hands you this. A gospel that tells you the physical world is a mistake, the other disciples are blind, and the ultimate hero is the man everyone else calls traitor. It's not just heresy, it's a reprogramming, and perhaps for some a relief. Because if Judas did what Jesus asked, then maybe betrayal isn't always betrayal. Maybe sometimes it's the hardest form of love. You can almost picture it: a lone figure hunched over a lamp in the flickering light of a cramped room, writing not in Hebrew, not in Greek, but in Coptic. Their stylus scratches across treated papyrus, etching out a gospel that would remain unread for more than 1,000 years. Whoever they were, they knew they weren't just telling a story. They were issuing a challenge to the church, to doctrine, and perhaps to history itself. The Gospel of Judas wasn't written by accident. It was a deliberate act of rebellion. Of course, the writer wasn't Judas. That much is clear. The Gospel was likely composed in the 2nd century, maybe around 150 CE, give or take a few decades. Judas by then had been dead for over 100 years, and his reputation had already ossified into villainy. So who would dare resurrect him, and why? The answer, it turns out, points directly to a fascinating and controversial group, the Scythian Gnostics. These weren't just spiritual outliers or eccentric monks with too much time on their hands. They were part of a sophisticated religious movement with its own mythology, language, and cosmic drama, one that ran parallel to, and often in opposition, with the early Christian orthodoxy. To understand their fingerprints on the Gospel of Judas, you need to know a little about the Scythians themselves. They took their name from Seth, the third son of Adam and Eve, whom they revered as a spiritual ancestor. In their cosmology, Seth wasn't just a genealogical afterthought. He was a divine revealer, a bearer of secret knowledge, a kind of proto-Christ figure. And that should give you a hint about their worldview. It wasn't about sin and repentance. It was about enlightenment and escape. Scythian Gnostics believed the material world was a prison crafted not by the highest God, but by a lesser, ignorant deity, the demiurge who mistook himself for the creator. This demiurge ruled over a series of archons, or cosmic bureaucrats, who enforced the illusion of the physical world. Sound like science fiction? It does. But to the Gnostics, it was spiritual truth, a way to explain suffering, corruption, and the strange hollowness of worldly power. And within that context, Jesus wasn't a sacrificial lamb. He was a divine agent sent from the higher realms to awaken select souls from the dream of materiality. Not everyone could hear the message. Most would cling to the demiurge, to the law, to their temples and their rituals. But a few, the Gnostics, the knowers, would understand. Which brings us back to Judas. In the Gospel of Judas, the other disciples are portrayed as hopelessly earthbound. They worship the wrong God. They focus on flesh and sacrifice. They're trapped in illusion. Only Judas receives the hidden truth, and in the act of turning Jesus over to the authorities, he enables the great escape. That idea didn't come from thin air. It aligns perfectly with the Scythian worldview. The author, almost certainly a member of this sect, used the Judas narrative as a vessel for their theology. They didn't care about preserving historical accuracy or pleasing church leaders. They were offering a new lens, one polished not by tradition, but by revelation. And here's where it gets even stranger. The Gospel of Judas was likely composed in Greek and later translated into Coptic, the language of Egyptian Christians. That means it traveled both geographically and theologically. It was copied, read, and passed along in communities that operated outside the bounds of imperial orthodoxy. These were people on the margins, sometimes literally underground, who clung to a very different vision of Jesus. An obscure yet significant clue to the author's identity comes from a name buried in another ancient work, the Against Heresies of Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyons, in Book 1, written around 180 CE. Irenaeus rails against a group he claims has authored a fictitious history, which they style the Gospel of Judas. He doesn't name the writer, but he clearly places the Gospel in the crosshairs of his anti-Gnostic campaign. That mention is crucial. It's one of the earliest references to the Gospel, and it tells us that it was already in circulation and already controversial in the 2nd century. The fact that Irenaeus saw fit to denounce it says a lot. He wasn't in the habit of wasting ink on texts with no traction. The Gospel of Judas was dangerous in his eyes because it reversed the moral polarity of the Christian story. It turned the villain into the visionary. And more alarmingly, it painted the established church, the emerging orthodoxy, as blind worshippers of the false god. This is the moment when the Gospel of Judas stops being just a curiosity and starts becoming a threat. Of course, not all Gnostic sects agreed with each other. Gnosticism wasn't a monolith. The Scythians had their own brand of theology distinct from the Valentinian or Basilidian schools. But they shared a common thread, the idea that salvation comes not from faith alone or from obedience, but from knowledge, gnosis. That's what the author of the Gospel of Judas was offering, a key, a cipher, a whisper in the ear of the one disciple brave enough to hear it. And here lies an open question that scholars still debate. Was the author writing with irony or conviction? Was the Judas in this gospel meant to be admired or pitied? Some argue the text is tragic, that Judas, in following Jesus' command, is doomed to isolation and death. Others see it as celebratory, that Judas's insight elevates him above even Peter and James. The ambiguity may be the point. Like all great mysteries, this one resists clean resolution. But the intent behind the gospel, that much is undeniable. Its author wasn't just telling a story. They were waging a theological war, a war that would be buried, but not forever. You've heard the word before, probably in the same hushed tone reserved for heresy or cult or something suspicious in a Dan Brown novel. Gnosticism. It sounds like a shadowy doctrine, cryptic, esoteric, maybe a little snobby. And to be fair, it often was. But beneath the jargon and celestial flowcharts, Gnosticism posed one of the most profound challenges to early Christianity. Not because it was evil, but because it was compelling. To understand why the Gospel of Judas sounds so strange, you have to understand the world that birthed it, a world where Gnostic thought was gaining serious traction. This wasn't just a fringe movement of sandal-wearing mystics. At its peak, Gnostic Christianity rivaled orthodoxy in both influence and imagination. If things had gone differently, today's New Testament might look very different, and Judas might be a saint. So what was Gnosticism exactly? Let's dim the lights and enter its cathedral of thought. At its core, Gnosticism begins with a gut feeling that something is wrong with the world. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. Not just the usual injustice, disease, and taxes, but a spiritual misalignment. The material world, to the Gnostic mind, wasn't just flawed. It was a trap, a dense fog separating us from the divine. And who built the trap? Not the true God, but a lesser one, a kind of cosmic bureaucrat often referred to as the demiurge. This being sometimes equated with the Old Testament's Yahweh, created the physical universe out of ignorance or arrogance. He thought he was supreme, but he wasn't. Above him, beyond him, was the true divine, an unreachable pleroma of light and perfection. The demiurge and his minions, the archons, govern the world like jailers guarding a prison of flesh. You, according to Gnostic thought, are not your body. You're a spark, a fragment of the divine. Trapped here, dressed in skin and bone and forgetting what you truly are. The goal isn't to be saved by faith. It's to remember. To wake up. That awakening, that gnosis, is liberation. Once you know who you really are, you can begin to unhook from the illusion. Now imagine reading the canonical Gospels through that lens. Jesus isn't just a teacher or a savior. He's a cosmic emissary. A being of divine light who descended into matter not to die for sin, but to reveal the map home. His death isn't an atonement. It's a jailbreak. And Judas, he's the only one who understands the plan. This is why the Gospel of Judas makes sense in a Gnostic framework. Jesus mocks the other disciples for worshiping the wrong God. He tells them their offerings are meaningless. He tells Judas that he alone will sacrifice the man that clothes me. He's not talking about betrayal. He's talking about release. And this is also why Gnosticism was so dangerous. To the early church still struggling to unify doctrine and survive imperial suspicion, Gnostic ideas were a theological Molotov cocktail. They undermined the goodness of creation, the authority of the Old Testament, and the neat salvation model offered by the crucifixion. More scandalous still, Gnostics didn't need a priest or a bishop to guide them. Their truth came from within, from secret knowledge, personal insight, and mystical experience. That made them hard to control, and no institution, especially one trying to define its own orthodoxy, likes to be told it's worshiping the jailer instead of the judge. But there's more. The danger wasn't just doctrinal, it was political. If the material world is a lie, then so are its hierarchies. Roman authority, temple power, even church leadership all become suspect. You can see why that message needed to be buried. It doesn't exactly inspire tax compliance or ecclesiastical loyalty. Here's a little-known wrinkle: not all Gnostics were anti-establishment loners. Some were educated elites, doctors, philosophers, scribes. They wrote in polished Greek, debated in smoky courtyards, and copied their scrolls with precision. The Gospel of Judas likely came from such a circle, people who weren't just rewriting the story, but repurposing it for a radically different metaphysical framework. And here's the twist that scholars still wrestle with. Gnosticism wasn't one thing. There was no central Gnostic church, no pope of gnosis. It was a loose constellation of beliefs, myths, and revelations. One group might revere Judas, another might worship Sophia, the divine wisdom. Still another might reject all of it and retreat into ecstatic silence. What united them wasn't dogma. It was disillusionment with the world and a hunger for a truth that lived beneath the surface. That more than anything is why the Gospel of Judas still unnerves. It doesn't just suggest a different interpretation of events. It invites you to peel back the curtain, to question whether what you see is what's real, to ask whether salvation might look like disobedience, and whether damnation might sometimes wear a bishop's robes. Which brings us back to a callback worth repeating: the Gospel of Judas isn't a biography, it's a confrontation. It forces us to look at Judas, that most reviled of names, and ask, what if he wasn't the villain? What if the villain is the story we've been told? The debate continues. Some theologians dismiss Gnostic texts as incoherent, unhinged, even dangerous. Others see them as valuable windows into early Christian diversity. And a few cautiously, quietly suggest that within their tangled cosmologies lies a forgotten whisper of something real, a secret waiting to be remembered. This is not the Jesus you met in Sunday school. He doesn't pat children on the head or multiply loaves with a smile. He doesn't walk gently beside fishermen or turn the other cheek with beatific calm. The Jesus of the Gnostics is sharper, stranger, and often unsettling. He laughs not with joy, but at the blindness of others. He speaks in riddles. He withholds. He reveals, and then obscures again. And in the Gospel of Judas, he chooses just one person to understand him. That person is not Peter. It is not John. It is Judas. In the text, the other disciples are bewildered. They ask naive questions. They argue about temples and sacrifices. They dream of becoming leaders, pillars of the faith. Jesus doesn't congratulate them. He rebukes them. He mocks their visions. He tells them they are worshiping the wrong God. It's not playful sarcasm, it's a cold dismissal. And then he turns to Judas and calls him apart. This scene isn't subtle. Jesus isolates Judas for secret teachings. He tells him of heavenly realms, of cosmic rulers, of hidden origins that stretch beyond the stars. The implication is clear: Judas sees what the others cannot. He understands that Jesus is not of this world. He sees through the illusions of ritual and law. He knows that this body, this mortal shell, is just a vehicle, one that must be destroyed so that the divine spark can return to its origin. There is a moment buried deep in the manuscript when Jesus says to Judas, "You will be cursed by the other generations, and you will come to rule over them." That line drips with ambiguity. Is it prophecy, a warning, a challenge, or all three at once? This Gnostic Jesus doesn't offer comfort. He doesn't die for sins in a redemptive arc. He doesn't weep in Gethsemane. He moves with purpose, almost impatience. He teaches not to heal the world, but to awaken a few those with ears to hear. And in that sense, he mirrors the Gnostic worldview perfectly. Salvation is not for all. It is for the knowing, for the ones who can see beyond appearances. One controversial interpretation suggests that Jesus needs Judas not just to complete the sacrifice, but to break free from the cycle. The betrayal isn't just a means to an end. It's an act of insight, almost a mystical ritual. Judas must sacrifice the man that clothes me. Not just betray Jesus the man, but unravel the illusion holding him in place. Now, this doesn't sit well with traditional theology. In the canonical Gospels, Jesus is both divine and human, united in purpose. He suffers, dies, and rises again as a triumph over death. But here, death isn't something to be conquered. It's something to be used as a doorway. Jesus in the Gospel of Judas doesn't dread the cross. He orchestrates it, and not as a martyr, but as an escape artist. This vision of Jesus as a cosmic revealer aligns closely with earlier Gnostic texts found at Nag Hammadi, such as the Apocryphon of John or the Gospel of Thomas. In those two, Jesus is portrayed as cryptic and transcendent. He doesn't explain, he triggers. He awakens, and he often uses paradox to do so. One moment he calls the world a corpse. The next he refers to light hidden in every being. This isn't lazy writing. It's intentional disorientation meant to short-circuit the rational mind and spark gnosis. That technique is everywhere in the Gospel of Judas. The teachings are dense, symbolic, sometimes baffling. Names of angels, layers of heaven, systems of divine emanation. It reads less like a gospel and more like a metaphysical code. And yet, at its center is a strangely tender relationship, the teacher and his final student. Not beloved John, not bold Peter, but Judas. And that detail, that inversion of expectation, has scholars squirming to this day. Some see it as pure heresy, a grotesque distortion of the message. Others believe it reflects an authentic stream of early Christian diversity, one that was later silenced by orthodoxy. And still others argue that the text is not about Judas at all, but about the Gnostic community itself, using Judas as a metaphor for the rejection and enlightenment they experienced. That last view raises an even deeper question. Was Judas chosen in the text because of who he was, or because of what he represented, a scapegoat? A misunderstood figure, a reviled outsider who might, in another light, be the only one who understood the truth. It's a powerful mirror for the Gnostics themselves, many of whom faced persecution and ridicule for their beliefs. There's a callback here to Section 3 when we first glimpsed the tone of the Gospel, not narrative but dialogical cryptic, riddled with symbols. The Jesus in those pages was not interested in being worshipped. He was interested in being understood by one. That one was Judas, and by extension, perhaps, the reader. Because the Gospel of Judas doesn't want followers. It wants participants. It wants you to lean forward, squint, and say, wait. What did he just mean by that? It wants confusion. Because confusion breaks the trance. And in that break, there may be a flicker of light. Or perhaps just a cruel joke. Because the Jesus of the Gnostics isn't always benevolent. He can be severe, remote, even manipulative. Some scholars suggest that his laughter, which appears multiple times, is not joy, but disdain, a divine being amused at the blindness of men. Others argue it's compassion in disguise, a knowing laugh at the tragedy of cosmic ignorance. The debate remains open. What's not open, though, is this. The Jesus of the Gospel of Judas is unlike anything you've seen in the canon. He is not here to comfort. He is here to awaken, whether you want to or not. You can feel the moment shift. The wind changes direction. The tone of the text grows quieter, heavier. And Jesus leans in close to Judas, almost as if sharing a secret that shouldn't survive the night. He tells him, "You will sacrifice the man that clothes me, not betray. Sacrifice. It's not just semantics." In the Gospel of Judas, what Judas is about to do isn't treason, it's participation. Not in a conspiracy, but in a divine plan. It's one of the most explosive implications of the text, that Jesus not only knew Judas would turn him in, he wanted him to. That Judas, far from acting against his master, was fulfilling a sacred instruction. That the arrest, the trial, the crucifixion were not tragic accidents or divine punishment. They were choreography. And Jesus, he was the one conducting the orchestra. The idea isn't entirely foreign even to the canonical Gospels. In the Gospel of John, for instance, Jesus predicts his betrayal multiple times. He speaks of it cryptically at the Last Supper. He tells Judas to do what he must do, and to do it quickly. These hints have always left room for interpretation. But the Gospel of Judas doesn't hint. It states. Jesus tells Judas directly that he alone will receive the true mysteries, that he will act and be cursed for it, but that his action is necessary. If you follow this line of thinking, everything begins to invert. The kiss in the garden becomes a sign of loyalty. The handing over to the authorities becomes a trust fall. Judas doesn't turn on Jesus, he turns him loose. And that's not a betrayal. That's obedience of the highest kind. This reframing introduces one of the most controversial theological implications in the entire Christian tradition, that the crucifixion was not only inevitable but intentional, and not by divine foreknowledge alone, but by divine design. That Jesus orchestrated his own death down to the final detail. That he needed Judas not as a traitor, but as a partner. You can see why this is radioactive for traditional doctrine. It reconfigures guilt, it rearranges blame, and worst of all, it makes Judas a hero in a narrative that for centuries defined him as a cautionary tale. Some scholars, particularly those steeped in Gnostic thought, embrace this view. They argue that the material world is a trap, and that Jesus' death was a means of release, not redemption. In that case, Judas becomes a liberator, a cosmic midwife, the one who opens the final gate. Others reject the notion entirely. They argue that the Gospel of Judas is not meant to exonerate but to expose, that Jesus' cryptic words are layered in irony, that Judas is being set up, manipulated, used, and this opens the door to a fascinating psychological debate: is Judas a tragic hero or a divine pawn? If Jesus planned it all, even the betrayal, then did Judas have a choice? Did he act out of understanding, or was he simply compelled by the will of someone far beyond him? There's an obscure passage near the end of the manuscript where Jesus tells Judas he will grieve much when you see the kingdom and all its generation. It's a cryptic phrase. Some interpret it as a reward, a vision of truth that will set Judas apart. Others read it as a curse, a glimpse of what he will never fully enter. And in that tension, the ambiguity deepens. Did Jesus bless Judas, or use him? Callback to section 6. We've already seen that the Jesus of the Gospel of Judas is not easy to read. He withholds. He speaks in riddles. He laughs when others suffer confusion. So it's entirely possible that this plan he shares with Judas is not meant to clarify but to destabilize, to force a break in logic, the kind of break that in Gnostic thought leads to awakening. But if Judas did have agency, if he understood what he was doing and did it anyway, then his story becomes one of the most complex moral acts in religious history. He becomes the disciple who did the unthinkable because he was asked to, who took the shame, the condemnation, and the eternal scorn of history, all to serve a higher will. It's a haunting idea that someone could be vilified for obeying God, that the greatest sin ever recorded might have actually been an act of faith. And perhaps that's why the text has survived despite everything, not because it provides a neat answer, but because it asks a question no one wants to answer out loud. If Jesus told Judas to do it, then who really betrayed whom? The Church has long taught that betrayal is a matter of intention, that Judas acted out of greed, out of bitterness, that he handed over his teacher for coins and then regretted it. But if that story changes, if intention shifts, then everything else starts to tremble. The sacrificial lamb, the cup in the garden, the trial before Pilate. All of it depends on the assumption that Judas acted against Jesus. If he didn't, then the entire framework of guilt and salvation takes on a different shape. And suddenly the word betrayal starts to lose its grip. We may never know what passed between Jesus and Judas in those final hours. The canonical Gospels give us fragments. The Gospel of Judas gives us a riddle. But one thing is certain: the story is not as simple as it once seemed. And perhaps it never was. It begins in the night sky. Or rather, it ends there, near the closing pages of the Gospel of Judas, just before the text cuts off like a torn whisper. Jesus shows Judas something unsettling, a vision of the stars. Not to awe him, not to guide him like the Magi, but to tell him, where he does not belong, you will be replaced by another, Jesus tells him, so that the 12 may again come to completion with their God. And then he points to the heavens, to a cosmic order Judas is not part of. It's a deeply strange moment made even stranger by the context. This is the gospel that elevated Judas, the one that seemed to hand him the secret keys. And now at the end, Jesus says, "You're out." But maybe, just maybe, that's the point. To make sense of this passage, you need to understand how the Gnostics viewed the stars. Unlike the warm, twinkling backdrop of modern romanticism, the stars in Gnostic cosmology were more like prison bars, celestial rulers, enforcers of fate. In many Gnostic texts, the 12 disciples are associated with 12 aeons or archons, rulers of the material cosmos. The zodiac wasn't just astrology, it was architecture, and every soul was caught in it. So when Jesus points to the stars and tells Judas that he won't ascend with the others, it's not necessarily a condemnation. It might be a compliment. The others, those faithful 12, are bound to the system. They represent the old world, the one ruled by the demiurge and his constellations. But Judas, he doesn't belong there. His path is different, more dangerous, more lonely, but perhaps also more free. There's an obscure echo of this in another Gnostic text, the Apocryphon of James, where Jesus tells a disciple that not everyone is meant to know these things. In the Gnostic universe, truth wasn't democratic. It wasn't for the masses. It was for the few who could carry it even if it crushed them. So what did Jesus show Judas in the stars? The answer remains speculative, fragmented. Some scholars suggest it was a vision of Judas's own exclusion, that he would not be part of the apostolic pantheon, not be remembered among the saints. And well, that part was certainly accurate. Others argue that the vision implies transcendence, that Judas would break free from the cycle of cosmic return, escaping the fate of the 12 entirely. Not imprisoned by the stars, but slipping through their grip like light through fingers. Still others take a darker view, that Judas, despite his moment of insight, is ultimately a tool used and discarded, that his fate is to be necessary, but not welcomed. A cosmic, tragic figure forever outside. This open question has kept theologians, historians, and dreamers circling for decades. Was Judas exalted or exiled? Did he ascend or vanish? And here's a peculiar callback to Section 4, when we trace the authorship of the Gospel to Scythian Gnostics, a group deeply invested in celestial hierarchies and the notion of transcending them. To them, escaping the star-governed universe wasn't a punishment. It was victory. In that light, Jesus' message to Judas reads differently. You will not ascend with them isn't rejection, it's liberation. But liberation always comes at a cost. Especially in stories like this. Even in the Gospel of Judas, where he's given the honor of receiving secret knowledge, Judas is also burdened with isolation. He understands what others cannot, but that understanding separates him forever. It's the classic mark of the initiate: to know is to leave the herd. To see is to lose the comfort of blindness. It makes you wonder, did Judas ever regret it? Not the act itself, the handing over, the kiss, the bargain, but the understanding, the burden of being the one who knew. The stars might show you the prison, but they don't always show you the way out. There's a strange beauty in imagining Judas staring at that sky, not pleading, not broken, but simply absorbing. Knowing that his name would echo in infamy. Knowing that the others would be venerated, carved into cathedrals and stained glass halos. And knowing that his reward was silence. And yet, despite it all, he acted. Perhaps that's what made him the perfect candidate. Not just obedience, but the willingness to vanish, to play the villain in someone else's narrative because it served the truth in another. It's a hard truth and a quiet one. The kind of truth that lives best in the desert under stars that don't care what they shine upon. So was Judas exalted or erased? The answer, like the stars themselves, may depend on where you're standing when you ask. There's a reason Judas had to be the villain. It wasn't just storytelling convenience. It was structural necessity, a narrative load-bearing wall in the architecture of Christian doctrine. Because if Judas wasn't a traitor, then someone else was. And that would raise questions the early church was not prepared to answer. The canonical Gospels don't waste time building moral complexity around Judas. He is introduced often abruptly as the one who would betray. The motivation varies, sometimes greed, sometimes satanic influence, sometimes vague disillusionment. But the function is always clear. Judas delivers Jesus to his enemies. He sets the cross in motion, and for that he becomes the symbol of treachery. But the intensity with which the church cemented that role tells its own story. Judas wasn't just portrayed as a failed disciple. He was transformed into something monstrous. His name became a slur. His act became unforgivable. While Peter, who also denied Jesus, is rehabilitated and crowned the rock of the church, Judas is given no path to redemption. No second chance. Just rope and infamy. This wasn't accidental. It was theological self-defense. In the first few centuries after Jesus' death, Christianity was still defining itself. Competing narratives, rival teachings, and splinter sects all vied for authority. And in the middle of it all was the question, how could the Messiah have died such a shameful death? If Jesus was divine, why did he end up on a Roman cross? To answer that, the early church leaned into prophecy. The betrayal had to happen. It fulfilled Scripture. Judas became a tragic necessity, like Pharaoh hardening his heart in Exodus. Someone had to play the villain so the greater plan could unfold. And once that role was fixed, it couldn't be challenged. Otherwise, the narrative coherence would unravel. But here's the uncomfortable bit. Framing Judas as pure evil served another purpose, one that conveniently redirected blame. As Christianity separated itself from its Jewish roots and spread through the Roman world, it became politically useful to shift responsibility for Jesus' death away from Rome and onto Judas, and by extension, the Jewish leadership. Judas became a theological scapegoat, and tragically over time, a cultural one as well. This is where things grow darker. In medieval passion plays, Judas is often portrayed with exaggerated features and greed-driven behavior that echo anti-Semitic tropes. His betrayal becomes not just personal, but representative. And that association, false, harmful, enduring, would go on to fuel centuries of bigotry and violence. All of this was built on a foundation that could not tolerate ambiguity. Judas had to be condemned. The simplicity of the story depended on it. Betrayal, arrest, sacrifice, redemption. It's a tidy arc, a moral machine that generates salvation. Add nuance, and the machine seizes up. But then, a crack appeared. Texts like the Gospel of Judas didn't just challenge the narrative, they threatened to reverse it. In this Gospel, Judas isn't the shadow behind the cross. He's the only one who sees the full picture. He acts not from greed, but from instruction. Not from weakness, but from trust. That's not a side note. That's dynamite under the pulpit. Imagine what it means if the church's greatest villain was actually obeying Jesus' will. It changes how we think about sacrifice, obedience, even sin itself. It suggests that righteousness might sometimes look like betrayal, and that judgment might be wrong. An obscure but telling example appears in some early Christian texts that nearly made it into the canon. In the Gospel of Matthew, Judas repents. He throws the silver back at the priests and hangs himself in despair. It's a moment of human vulnerability that's often overlooked. Even in the dominant narrative, there's a flicker of conscience, a man torn apart by what he's done. But that nuance is quickly buried under centuries of condemnation. Why? Because Judas's redemption was too dangerous. If he could be forgiven, then so could anyone. And if he acted at Jesus' request, then maybe we don't understand obedience the way we think we do. Some early theologians wrestled with this. Origen, the brilliant but often heretical-tasting church father, once speculated that even Judas might one day be saved. That divine mercy could extend even to the betrayer. But he was careful not to push too hard. Others weren't so cautious. The result was excommunication, exile, or worse. And yet the idea lingered. Quietly. In art. In poetry. In strange apocryphal texts that survived the fires. The notion that Judas might not be what we've been told has never fully died. Because deep down in the cracks of orthodoxy, there's a discomfort, a whisper that maybe we rushed to judgment. Maybe we needed someone to blame, and chose the one who was easiest to cast out. That's the church's problem with Judas. Not just that he betrayed Jesus, but that his story might betray the simplicity of the church itself. Because if Judas was following orders, if he was chosen, not condemned, then who are we to decide who the villain really was? It's easy to imagine the scene: a stern bishop seated at his desk in late 2nd century Gaul, quill in handbrows furrowed, scribbling furiously in Greek. The parchment before him isn't a sermon or a letter. It's a catalogue of threats, names, texts, teachings, each one carefully described and then condemned. His name was Irenaeus, and the book he was writing would become one of the foundational weapons in the war for Christian orthodoxy. Its title, Against Heresies. He wasn't writing casually. This was an act of theological warfare. The Christian world, in his view, was under siege, not by Romans or lions or burning arenas, but by ideas. Competing interpretations of Jesus' salvation, God creation, all bubbling up from a wide and unruly sea of sects. Some said Jesus was just a man. Others said he was never truly flesh. Some believed in dozens of divine realms, others in none. And in the midst of this dizzying marketplace of gospels and gods, Irenaeus set out to draw the line, to define what was true by hunting down what wasn't. And there, buried in Book 4 chapter 31, is a passing line, easy to miss. He mentions a group, nameless, faceless, who declare that Cain, Esau, the Sodomites, and all such persons are themselves the very same as were set free by the Savior. And then without hesitation he adds, they produce a fictitious history which they style the Gospel of Judas. There it is, the earliest surviving mention of the text. Not in reverence, not in curiosity, but in scorn. To Irenaeus, the very idea of redeeming Judas was blasphemy, heresy of the highest order. It didn't just bend theology, it inverted it. It took the cosmic drama of sin and salvation and flipped the script. Villains became heroes. Condemned souls became liberated ones. That wasn't a new revelation. That was chaos. And Irenaeus had no patience for chaos. But here's what's often missed. His outrage was a sign of the gospel of Judas's relevance. He didn't waste ink on idle nonsense. If a text had traction, if communities were reading it, passing it around, building their worldview on it, that's when it earned a place in his blacklist. This is an important historical fact. By the time Irenaeus denounced it, the Gospel of Judas was already in circulation, already copied, already taught. The Scythian Gnostics, or a group like them, had taken the bones of a scandal and rebuilt it into revelation. and that made it dangerous. To understand why Irenaeus responded with such urgency, you have to understand what he was trying to build. Orthodoxy in the 2nd century wasn't a given, it was a project. There was no New Testament yet, no finalized creed, no Vatican. Christianity at that point was more like a loose coalition of spiritual entrepreneurs, each with their own take on who Jesus was and what he came to do. And that terrified Irenaeus, because where there's no unity, there's no power, no authority. So he began to codify what he called the rule of faith. One God, one creation, one Savior born of a virgin crucified under Pontius Pilate, raised on the 3rd day. Simple, ordered, clean. Gnosticism, in contrast, was anything but clean. Its cosmology looked like a star map scribbled by a poet in crisis. Dozens of divine beings, layers of heavens, strange emanations, competing creators. Salvation didn't come from obedience. It came from inner knowledge. And Jesus, he was less of a savior and more of a revealer and emissary from beyond, tasked with waking up the few who could handle the truth. In that ecosystem, the Gospel of Judas made perfect sense. It was a Gnostic thunderbolt aimed directly at the heart of orthodoxy. And Irenaeus felt the shock. He saw the danger not just in the theology but in the implications. If Judas was chosen, if betrayal was part of the plan, then the cross wasn't redemption. It was escape. And the church, with its emerging priesthood, sacraments, and hierarchy, wasn't the path to salvation. It was the continuation of the illusion. So Irenaeus swung back hard. His against heresies wasn't just an inventory. It was a purge. He named the Valentinians, the Basilidians, the Sethians, and more. And while he didn't name individual authors, perhaps because they were already underground, he made sure their texts were marked for destruction. The strategy worked. Over the centuries, the church consolidated power. The canon was formed. Heretical texts were banned, burned, or buried, and the Gospel of Judas, it vanished. For more than 1,000 years, not a single copy was seen. It became little more than a footnote in an old polemic, until it wasn't. Until a box surfaced in the Egyptian desert, and the words re-emerged, brittle, faded, but still defiant. And here's the twist: Irenaeus helped preserve it. Ironically, because his denunciation was one of the few breadcrumbs that allowed modern scholars to confirm the text's authenticity. His anger was a historical fingerprint, proof that someone long ago wrote a gospel daring enough to make Judas the key. It's a reminder that sometimes the loudest condemnation is also the best evidence that something mattered, and that those who write history often do so with a red pen. It's tempting to think of suppression as dramatic flames licking ancient pages, inquisitors shouting scrolls reduced to ash. And sometimes, yes, history burns its heresies with theatrical flair. But just as often, it buries them. Quietly. Without spectacle. A hole in the ground. A sealed jar. A cave in the desert. Silence, not fire, is the more reliable censor. The Gospel of Judas wasn't lost because no one cared. It was hidden because someone did. Someone read its words, maybe by lamplight, maybe with trembling hands, and realized what they were holding could destroy more than it revealed. Not because it was evil, but because it was dangerous. Because it told a different story. One too strange, too inverted, too threatening to let circulate freely. This was no marginal scribble. The manuscript we recovered was part of a bound codex, professionally copied, structured, preserved. It had value at least to the community that created it. But once the theological tide turned and orthodoxy hardened into law, that value became risk. And risk had to be managed. So someone, maybe a monk, maybe a frightened believer, buried it. We don't know exactly when, possibly around the 4th century, give or take. That's when the church, backed by imperial muscle, began its real campaign of standardization. The Council of Nicaea had drawn the first hard lines in the sand. The canon of Scripture was congealing into something close to what we know today. And texts like the Gospel of Judas, texts that didn't fit, had no future in the libraries of the faithful. So they disappeared. One by one, some burned, yes, but many simply slipped beneath the surface. That's what happened at Nag Hammadi too, where in 1945 a sealed jar of codices was discovered in the Egyptian desert, a treasure trove of forgotten gospels, treatises, hymns. It's no coincidence that both caches, Nag Hammadi and the Judas Codex, emerged from the same region and likely from the same cultural moment, the final squeeze of theological tolerance. But why bury them instead of destroy them? There's a strange reverence even in suppression. To burn a text is to deny its value, but to bury it, that's something else. That's a kind of reluctant preservation, as if the person who hid it knew that even heresy has a future, and that one day maybe the world would be ready to read it again. And buried it was. For more than a millennium, the Gospel of Judas remained trapped in the earth, surviving heat, damp, decay, looters' mold. It was only by sheer chance that it resurfaced at all. When it finally did in the 1970s, it wasn't discovered by a scholar in a robe, but by a farmer digging for stone. He had no idea what he'd found. Then came the smuggling, the hiding, the years spent neglected in a safe deposit box. At one point, the codex was stored in a freezer, a darkly ironic metaphor for the centuries of historical deep freeze it had already endured. And then finally, restoration. When the manuscript was translated and published in 2006, its impact rippled outward immediately. Scholars debated, journalists scrambled, believers blinked. The gospel had returned not with a roar, but with a dry, crumbling whisper, and yet it still had something to say. There's an obscure but haunting line in the text that often goes unnoticed. Jesus tells Judas, "You will be cursed by the other generations." It reads like prophecy. And in a way it came true. Judas was cursed, reviled. His name became a synonym for betrayal in 6 languages. His story was simplified into villainy, and his gospel, if he ever had one, was sealed in the ground. But what if that was part of the story too? What if the burial of the gospel wasn't just a historical accident, but a necessary exile, a kind of resurrection in waiting? There's something almost poetic in the way it returned. Quiet, half-rotted, struggling to be heard, and yet unmistakably alive. It hadn't been destroyed. It had been delayed. And delay in stories like these is never neutral. The Gospel of Judas wasn't just a text. It was a time capsule, not only of theology, but of conflict, the spiritual and political pressure of a movement, trying to control its narrative. In the end, suppression didn't make it vanish. It just gave it silence to mature in. Because sometimes the most dangerous ideas aren't the loud ones. They're the ones still breathing beneath the sand. It would be comforting, wouldn't it, if the Gospel of Judas stood entirely alone, a single strange anomaly. A heretical whisper from the shadows, easy to isolate, easy to dismiss. But the truth is more complicated and far more unsettling. Because once you know what to look for, echoes of the Judas as initiated narrative begin to appear in other places. Not many, not loudly, but just enough to suggest that something deeper might have been buried, not just one gospel, but a thread carefully unspooled, then quietly rewoven elsewhere. Start with the canon. It's where most would never think to look. After all, if the Gospel of Judas is the radical voice, Surely the canonical Gospels are its silencing choir. And yet, even here the seams sometimes show. Take the Gospel of John. It offers the longest and most detailed depiction of Judas, and also the most ambiguous. At the Last Supper, Jesus turns to Judas and says, "What you are about to do, do quickly." It's a chilling moment often interpreted as a grim command or a resigned acknowledgement. But it's also curiously free of condemnation. Jesus doesn't curse him. He doesn't beg him to stop. He simply allows. More intriguing still is what happens next. None of the other disciples understand what Jesus means. Some think Judas is being sent to buy supplies. Others assume he's arranging a charitable gift. And that confusion tucked awkwardly into the narrative feels like a moment where clarity was deliberately blurred. A kind of narrative misdirection that raises the question who really knew what was happening in that upper room. Then there's the kiss, that infamous signal in the Garden of Gethsemane. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus' response is, "Calm, friend. Do what you came to do." Friend. That word hangs heavy. It's not sarcasm. It's not fury. It's recognition. Even in the act of betrayal, there's a thread of intimacy that refuses to break. Some apologists wave this away as irony or divine restraint. But for others, it's a crack in the wall. A moment when the traditional mask slips and a deeper current pushes through. Move beyond the canon and the hints become more provocative. In the Gospel of Thomas, one of the better-known Gnostic texts from the Nag Hammadi cache, Jesus speaks in riddles, parables, and koans. There's no crucifixion narrative, no resurrection. Instead, salvation comes from recognizing the divine within. It's not about sin. It's about seeing. And if that's the true goal, then Judas, the one who knew in the Gospel of Judas, starts to look less like a traitor and more like a success story. Then there's the dialogue of the Savior, another Gnostic fragment, in which Jesus speaks privately with his disciples about hidden truths and warns them that the works of woman and man will not be saved. It's harsh, cryptic, and radically dualistic, a world divided between those who awaken and those who remain asleep. Judas in that system begins to resemble a kind of sacrificial transmitter, someone who absorbs the curse so that others might begin to question the illusion. Even some fragments from apocryphal acts and pseudo-epigraphal writings contain passing nods to a more complex role for Judas as someone burdened, chosen, or torn between knowledge and duty. None of these fully reframe him, but they suggest a discomfort, a sense that his role was too neat, too cleanly packaged in the mainstream telling. And it's not just the texts themselves. Early church fathers like Origen and Clement of Alexandria occasionally hinted at broader readings of salvation, including the possibility that even Judas might be redeemed. They never pushed it far. The institutional risk was too great. But the fact that they felt compelled to mention it at all is telling. What emerges is a mosaic, not a single clear image, but a pattern of fragments. Each piece on its own might be dismissed, but together they begin to form the faint outline of an alternate tradition. One where Judas wasn't simply the villain, one where his role was necessary, or at the very least, not fully understood. It calls back to the unspoken grief of earlier sections, that moment when Jesus tells Judas he'll be cursed by future generations. The curse, it seems, was not just in name, but in forgetting. In stripping away the ambiguity, the nuance, the ache of what might have been a deeply personal sacrifice. Instead, we were left with a caricature coin's kiss rope, but the texts never fully aligned. They left loose threads, whispers of doubt. The question then isn't whether every early Christian saw Judas differently. Most didn't. The dominant narrative held. But enough divergence existed, enough textual noise to suggest that something didn't sit right. That maybe history had collapsed too many meanings into one. Judas the betrayer, Judas the tool, Judas the scapegoat, Judas the friend, and perhaps beneath it all, Judas the obedient one. You arrive at the earliest of the 4 canonical Gospels, and something feels unfinished. The Gospel of Mark, the rawest and arguably most enigmatic of the group, ends not with triumph or clarity, but with a whisper of fear. The stone is rolled away, the tomb is empty, and a mysterious figure in white tells the women that Jesus has risen, but they run away in terror and say nothing to anyone because they are afraid. That's it. No appearances. No road to Emmaus. No doubting Thomas. Just an empty space where a resurrection should be. And for centuries, readers have squinted at that abrupt conclusion and asked, was that really the ending? The answer is both yes and no. The earliest manuscripts of Mark stop at chapter 16, verse 8. Those that continue the so-called long ending with Jesus appearing, commissioning the disciples, and ascending to heaven were likely added later. They read differently, more polished, more aligned with the other Gospels, almost like someone realized Mark had left the stage too early and rushed to tie up the loose ends. But why does that matter in a story about Judas? Because the earliest ending of the earliest Gospel leaves room, uncomfortable room. Without post-resurrection scenes, there's no restoration of Peter, no confrontation of the 11, no condemnation or absolution of Judas. It ends not with clarity, but with confusion, with silence. And silence in religious texts is rarely empty. It often conceals tension. Competing narratives, the echoes of versions no longer allowed to speak. What if Judas's story was one of those, not just an error to be corrected, but a voice that once stood alongside the others, then was buried both literally and literarily? The abrupt ending of Mark has long been interpreted in different ways. Some say it was intentional, a literary technique to leave the reader unsettled, invited into the mystery. Others argue the original ending was lost, the scroll damaged or unfinished. But either way, the result is the same. Mark leaves us with absence. A resurrection we do not see. A Jesus we do not hear. A betrayal unresolved. And then there's the narrative treatment of Judas himself in this gospel. Mark introduces Judas early, but doesn't dwell on his motivations. He agrees to betray Jesus, receives money, and leads the arresting party. No dialogue, no kiss, no remorse. It's a skeletal account enough to move the plot forward, but curiously thin compared to later retellings. Matthew, for example, adds Judas's suicide and the infamous field of blood. Luke adds satanic possession. John makes Judas a tragic villain steeped in greed. But Mark, he's almost dispassionate. Some scholars argue this reflects Mark's intention to focus on the divine drama, not the psychology of individuals. Others suggest that the Judas narrative was still forming, that his total villainy had not yet crystallized in the Christian imagination. Either way, it's clear that the portrayal of Judas intensified over time. The further you move from Mark, the more developed the blame becomes. Which raises a question: if the earliest gospel left Judas's motives ambiguous, was that because they were still being debated? It's a subtle but crucial point. Because if the earliest Christian communities hadn't yet agreed on Judas's role, then the Gospel of Judas doesn't arrive out of nowhere. It arrives in the vacuum, in the gaps. It offers an interpretation that could have once existed alongside others until the others were weeded out. And perhaps the strangest clue in Mark's account is not what it says, but what it doesn't. There is no resurrection encounter, no vindication, no resolution. The women flee the tomb in fear and tell no one. The gospel ends literally in silence. That silence leaves space, space for other endings, other voices, and perhaps other gospels. It's in this quiet that a gospel like Judas's could breathe. A gospel that doesn't resolve the story, but rewrites its pivot. That says the one who triggered the passion wasn't the saboteur, but the one who understood the ending before it happened. That's what makes Mark so important. Not because it agrees with the gospel of Judas, it doesn't, but because it reveals just how fluid the story still was, how unfinished, how wide the margins had once been before time and councils and orthodoxy closed them. And in those early spaces, Judas might not have been the devil. He might have been a question. For someone whose name would come to symbolize ultimate betrayal, Judas Iscariot arrives in the gospel narratives as a near-complete mystery. There's no backstory, no origin scene, no real insight into how he became a disciple in the first place. He simply is present among the 12, moving through the margins, occasionally asking questions, and then suddenly stepping into the center of the narrative just in time to bring it crashing down, and then just as quickly he vanishes again. Compared to Peter, John, or even Thomas, Judas is practically a ghost. The Gospels tell us almost nothing about his life before Jesus. No village, no occupation, no defining moment of conversion. Even his surname Iscariot is debated. Some say it links him to the town of Kerioth in Judea. Others suggest it refers to the Sicarii dagger-wielding zealots, political assassins who resisted Roman rule. And a few argue it's not a surname at all, but a coded label, a corrupted phrase passed down like a whisper. The point is, we don't know. And that not knowing has become a canvas. For centuries, theologians, artists, and storytellers have projected motivations onto Judas: greed, jealousy, disappointment, even nationalism. Perhaps he grew disillusioned with Jesus' refusal to lead a revolution. Perhaps he felt betrayed himself. Or perhaps, as the Gospel of Judas implies, he was the only one who did understand. But without those missing years, without a traceable arc, Judas becomes less a man and more a mirror. A blank face onto which each generation casts its fears. There's an eerie parallel here with figures like Cain or the Pharaoh of Exodus characters, whose roles are pivotal, but whose inner worlds are closed to us. They act, they fulfill their function, but we never get to sit with them. We don't hear their side, and in that silence they become symbols. Judas becomes the traitor, the betrayer, the one who kissed and killed. But was he always this way? There's an obscure detail in the Gospel of Luke often glossed over. Then Satan entered Judas. It suggests a possession, a moment where Judas ceased to be himself. But that framing creates a convenient shield. If he was overtaken by darkness, then perhaps he was not responsible. Or perhaps the Gospel writer needed an explanation that absolved Jesus of poor judgment. After all, how could the Son of God choose a disciple who would later ruin everything? That's the uncomfortable tension. Theologically, Judas's betrayal had to happen. The crucifixion depended on it. But emotionally, narratively, someone had to carry the guilt. And with no personal history to defend him, Judas was an easy target. It's worth pausing here to consider how stories evolve in the absence of detail. Silence invites invention. The missing years of Judas became fertile ground for elaboration, especially in later centuries. Medieval legends filled in gaps with grotesque flair. One tale claims Judas was born under a cursed star, abandoned by his parents, raised in sin, and destined from birth to betray Christ. Others painted him as greedy from the beginning, pilfering from the disciples' purse, and harboring resentment long before the Last Supper. But these are literary fill-ins, moral theater, designed to reinforce a conclusion already reached. What if instead we treat the missing years as precisely what they are missing, not because they were never there, but because they were removed? Here's a controversial but increasingly explored idea that the absence of Judas's backstory isn't natural, but curated. That somewhere along the line, efforts were made not to explore Judas, but to erase him. To narrow his identity to one act and ensure that no empathy could leak through the cracks. And this calls back to a growing theme that simplification is power. By collapsing Judas into one role, one deed, the church gained a cautionary tale, one that reinforced obedience, submission, and moral clarity. But in doing so, they might have silenced a much more complicated and perhaps more illuminating figure. The Gospel of Judas offers an alternative, not a detailed biography, but a different shape. Here, Judas isn't silent. He asks questions. He receives private instruction. He sees visions. He walks the edge of knowledge and despair. It's not a portrait in the traditional sense, it's a silhouette lit from the opposite direction. Which raises a difficult, haunting question: what if the Judas we inherited is not the real Judas, but the Judas we needed him to be? Without a backstory, he becomes pliable, a stand-in, a symbol. And in that sense, he serves more functions in death than he ever could in life. Perhaps that's the final cruelty, not that Judas was condemned, but that he was never truly known. A name without a voice. A face turned away just before the moment we needed to see it. Step back from the theology for a moment. Set aside the gospel verses, the cosmic metaphors, the divine mysteries. Just look at the facts on the ground. Jesus of Nazareth was arrested, interrogated, and executed by the Roman state. Crucifixion was not a Jewish punishment. It was Roman, brutal, public, and reserved for enemies of the empire. And yet somehow, over time, the blame for that death began to shift. Away from the imperial machine that wielded the nails, and toward a single man with a kiss. Judas. One man, 12 words, one kiss, and an entire machinery of guilt moved silently out of frame. This redirection didn't happen all at once. In the earliest gospel accounts, Rome is certainly present, Pilate is there, the soldiers are there, the cross is raised by Roman hands. But the narrative focus begins to pivot. Judas becomes the trigger, the high priests become the accusers, Pilate becomes the reluctant participant, even washing his hands like a bureaucrat caught in divine paperwork. And somewhere in that reframing, the empire fades into the background, and a disciple becomes the villain. But was that framing theological necessity or political strategy? The early church, especially in its first 3 centuries, existed under Roman rule. It was fragile, persecuted, and in desperate need of legitimacy. Aligning too closely with a version of the gospel that painted Rome as the clear villain wasn't just spiritually complicated, it was institutionally dangerous. Blaming Judas, and by extension the Jews, became an effective way to deflect imperial responsibility. And that shift would have consequences far beyond doctrine. Here lies a historical fact that many find uncomfortable. The demonization of Judas opened the door to centuries of anti-Semitic rhetoric. Judas became the embodiment of Jewish betrayal. His act was expanded from personal failure to ethnic symbol. Medieval sermons, passion plays, and paintings often portrayed Judas with exaggerated stereotypical features. His greed, his suicide, his fall all became metaphors for the supposed faithlessness of a people. It wasn't theology. It was propaganda wearing theological clothes. And all of it hinged on a premise that Judas acted alone from wicked motives. that he was not following instruction, not fulfilling prophecy, not playing a role, but betraying his master for silver. A clean story, a tidy villain, and conveniently one who absorbed blame that might otherwise fall on the empire. But the gospel of Judas, strange and subversive as it is, refuses to cooperate with that framing. In it, Judas is not driven by greed. He is not the embodiment of a corrupt people. He's the only one who understands, and his actions, far from being selfish, are painted as devastating obedience. He doesn't betray, he participates. This reframing doesn't just shift moral responsibility. It reintroduces Rome to the picture. If Judas was acting with Jesus' blessing, if the crucifixion was planned, then the real machinery of death lies elsewhere, with the state, with those who wielded violence as policy. And suddenly the question of blame widens again. There's an obscure but important clue in the Acts of the Apostles. Peter, speaking to a crowd in Jerusalem, says, "This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross." It's a curious blend. Divine plan meets human violence. The phrase "wicked men" has been interpreted in many ways, but some scholars argue it originally pointed not to Judas or the priests, but to Roman authorities. Over time, that attribution blurred. The narrative hardened, and Judas became a theological sponge, soaking up centuries of discomfort, absorbing the complexities of complicity until only one villain remained. But what if that villainy was designed not by Judas, but by the storytellers? Here's where the idea of a scapegoat takes on literal form. In ancient Jewish ritual, a scapegoat was symbolically burdened with the sins of the people and driven into the wilderness. Judas, in this sense, becomes the Christian scapegoat, the one onto whom sin, betrayal, and divine failure are projected. Not because he deserved it, but because the system needed him to carry it. And as always, the absence of detail helped. With no personal history, no clear motive, no recorded defense, Judas was easily shaped. A silhouette filled with whatever anxieties the moment required. The church needed purity. Judas gave them contrast. The empire needed distance. Judas gave them cover. The irony is stark. In a story built on the suffering of an innocent man, misunderstood by the powers of the world, another man may have been misunderstood and condemned for similar reasons. Judas, like Jesus, becomes a victim of narrative necessity, but only one of them was given a resurrection. So we are left with a question. No gospel answers plainly, was Judas condemned for his actions, or for what his presence allowed others to hide? And if that's true, then the greatest betrayal may not have been Judas turning in Jesus, but history turning on Judas. It's the most infamous payment in history, a handful of silver coins, cold and clinking, in the shadows of the temple, exchanged not for goods or services, but for the Son of Man. 30 pieces. The number has echoed for 2 millennia, etched into paintings, sermons, songs. But what if it's more symbol than fact? More theological punctuation than historical record? The canonical Gospels are oddly inconsistent when it comes to the details of the transaction. Only Matthew names the amount 30 silver coins. Mark and Luke simply say, Judas agreed to betray Jesus for money, no sum attached. John doesn't mention payment at all, focusing instead on Judas's supposed greed and his role as keeper of the group's finances. But Matthew, the most structurally rigid of the four, gives us a number. A very specific one. 30. Why, here's the historical fact in the Hebrew Bible, specifically in the book of Exodus. 30 shekels was the price to be paid if a slave was gored by an ox. It was compensation. Not for murder, not for betrayal, for property damage. A dead slave was worth 30 silver coins. And by inserting that number into the Passion narrative, Matthew doesn't just record an amount, he invokes a symbol. He frames Jesus' worth through the lens of ancient law. Betrayed not just for money, but for the lowest possible value a life could carry. It's an act of theological irony. The Messiah priced like a slave. But is it historical? There's no external evidence for the amount. The sum appears only in Matthew, and some scholars believe it may have been retrofitted to fulfill a prophecy, specifically a passage in Zechariah that reads, "So they weighed out 30 shekels of silver as my wages. Throw it to the potter." It's cryptic, poetic, and depending on the translation, eerily resonant. Matthew even weaves it into the post-betrayal narrative, saying that Judas, stricken with remorse, threw the silver into the temple, and the priests used it to buy the potter's field. But even that detail is layered with ambiguity. In Acts of the Apostles, it's not Judas who returns the money, it's the priests who buy the field. Judas in that version simply dies in disgrace. No repentance, no silver returned. The two accounts sit uneasily together like puzzle pieces from different boxes, and that uncertainty invites speculation. What if the silver isn't literal? What if it's literary? Some theologians argue that the payment represents the perceived cheapness of betrayal, the idea that the most sacred can be sold for almost nothing. Others suggest it's a critique of the religious establishment, painting the priests not as righteous defenders of the faith, but as cold negotiators with blood on their books. But the Gospel of Judas, perhaps unsurprisingly, doesn't dwell on coins at all. There's no payment, no haggling, no pouch of silver weighed and handed over. Instead, the focus is entirely spiritual, a transaction not of money, but of knowledge. Judas's act isn't motivated by greed. It's driven by instruction. And in that absence, in that refusal to even mention the silver, the gospel offers a silent rejection of the entire economic metaphor. Because silver implies corruption, but obedience, that's harder to vilify. Still, the image of Judas clutching a bag of silver has endured. Painters loved it, a perfect visual shorthand for treachery. A man alone in a dark corridor, coins in his hand, guilt creeping across his face. It's so effective, so easy to grasp, that it has become almost untouchable. A universal symbol so deeply embedded that few pause to ask, what if it never happened? Or worse, what if it did, but the coins were never the reason? There's an obscure thread in the writings of Papias, a 2nd century bishop, who claims that Judas became swollen, grotesque, and burst apart in a field, a vivid and unsettling variation on his death. No mention of silver, just decay. It's a detail so extreme it borders on allegory punishment rendered through bodily horror. And perhaps that's the point. When facts grow thin, myth rushes in to fill the space. 30 pieces of silver, a number, a metaphor, a shadow, and maybe, just maybe, a distraction. Because if Judas acted at Jesus' request, as the Gospel of Judas claims, then money becomes irrelevant. A prop for the audience, a pocket-sized scapegoat. The real transaction wasn't economic, it was metaphysical. Knowledge for trust, role for sacrifice. So why has the silver stuck? Because it's clean, tidy. It anchors the betrayal in something we understand. Greed, human weakness, something ugly but relatable. If Judas can be bought, we don't have to ask why he did it. We don't have to wonder if he should have done it. We just count the coins, shake our heads, move on. But the question remains, was it ever about the silver? Or did the church need 30 pieces to cover the cost of something much harder to explain? It doesn't take long to notice the Gospel of Judas doesn't just differ from the 4 canonical Gospels. It challenges them, openly. deliberately. Like someone not content to quietly add an alternative perspective, but instead walking into a cathedral and flipping the altar. Where Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John build toward a cohesive narrative of divine incarnation, public ministry, betrayal, sacrifice, and resurrection, the Gospel of Judas builds something else entirely. Not a biography, not a story, but a revelation not of Jesus, but from him handed in secret to the one disciple every other gospel condemns. And right from the start, the tone is different. Jesus doesn't teach crowds. He doesn't heal lepers or preach on hillsides. He speaks in private, in riddles. He separates himself from the others. And when the disciples try to approach him, he laughs. Not kindly, not lovingly, but mockingly. He laughs at their small visions, their wrong-headed worship, their fumbling attempts to understand a world they barely see. In the canon, the disciples are confused but loyal. In the Gospel of Judas, they are blind, and only Judas sees. This creates a direct and unmistakable tension, because if Judas is the one Jesus trusts, the only one, then the entire structure of apostolic succession begins to crack. The Peter on this rock theology falters. The idea that the church was built on the faithful understanding of the remaining 11 comes into question. The Gospel of Judas doesn't just tell a different story, it undermines the credibility of the foundational story. That alone would have been enough to raise eyebrows. But the differences go deeper. In the canonical Gospels, the God of the Old Testament is the same as the Father Jesus calls upon. One divine being, continuous and eternal. But in the Gospel of Judas, that equation is shattered. The God of creation. The God worshipped by the other disciples is not the true God. He's a lower entity, a ruler of the material world, ignorant of the higher realms. In other words, the God of the Hebrew Bible is at best mistaken, and at worst a deceiver. It's the kind of theological move that sets off alarms. To mainstream Christian theology, creation is good. The body is good. Jesus came into the world not to escape it, but to redeem it. The cross is central, the moment where death is defeated and grace made manifest. But in the Gospel of Judas, the body is a cage. The crucifixion is not an atonement, it's an exit strategy. Jesus doesn't suffer to save others. He asks Judas to liberate him from flesh. That's not a variation on the gospel. That's a complete rewrite, and the characters change with it. Peter, so central in the synoptics, is dismissed in the Gospel of Judas. He's portrayed as spiritually blind, obsessed with building the wrong kind of temple. The other disciples, too, are shown offering sacrifices not to the true God, but to a lesser one. Their piety is misplaced, their devotion misdirected, and that leaves Judas. In the canon, he is the betrayer. The one who dips his bread, disappears into the night, and returns with soldiers. In the Gospel of Judas, he is the only one who understands that Jesus must die, and more importantly, why. He doesn't betray, he obeys. Jesus says to him, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." That line alone could collapse centuries of theology, because it reframes the crucifixion not as a brutal injustice or even a divine sacrifice, but as a kind of holy euthanasia. Judas doesn't hand Jesus over to suffer, he helps him escape. The man that clothes me, the body, is removed so that Jesus' divine self can return to its origin. In doing so, Judas becomes the only disciple who grasps the full truth. And that reverses the gospel logic entirely. It's an open challenge to the canon, to its chronology, its tone, and most of all, its purpose. And this has led to decades of scholarly debate. Some argue that the Gospel of Judas is a parody, a Gnostic satire mocking the naivete of apostolic tradition. Others believe it's deadly serious, a sincere attempt to preserve a mystical truth that Orthodox Christianity deliberately buried. There's no clear consensus. What's certain, though, is that the text was written in conversation with the canon, not in ignorance of it. It mirrors certain episodes only to twist them. It borrows familiar elements, then reverses their moral poles. It assumes a reader who already knows the story, and then dares to suggest they've misunderstood it all. And here again, the absence of Judas in the later parts of the canonical Gospels becomes haunting. We never hear from him again after the act. No testimony, no defense, just silver remorse rope. A man framed entirely by his worst moment, a perfect vacuum in which alternative gospels could grow. So the question becomes, was the Gospel of Judas a radical innovation, or a restoration of a thread already being silenced? Whatever the answer, one thing is clear: the Gospel of Judas doesn't just sit outside the canon, it stares it down. Imagine a universe that doesn't begin with, "Let there be light," but with a fracture, a crack in the divine that births layers of flawed realities. Not one heaven, but many. Not one God, but a cascading hierarchy of spirits, rulers, and half-seeing creators. This is the cosmos of the Gospel of Judas. Not flat, not friendly, and not ruled by the benevolent father of the canonical Gospels, but by a swarm of cosmic powers more bureaucratic than divine. In this vision, the physical world is not a miracle. It's a mistake. And the body a prison of meat and memory. The goal is not salvation through belief, but liberation through knowledge gnosis. Not everyone can attain it. Only a few are capable of awakening, and even fewer are strong enough to act on what they've seen. This is the metaphysical scaffolding behind the Gospel of Judas, a Gnostic cosmology that challenges not just doctrine, but the entire emotional foundation of Christian belief. At the top of this cosmology is the great invisible spirit, an unnameable source of all things too vast to be understood, too pure to be touched. From this source emanate divine beings called aeons, who dwell in perfect stillness. But somewhere along the chain, a rupture occurs. A lesser entity, ignorant, proud, blind, declares itself the true God and begins crafting a world of matter unaware of its own incompleteness. This being is the demiurge. To many Gnostic writers, the demiurge is the God of Genesis, the one who says, "I am the Lord thy God," and that declaration, far from divine truth, is seen as cosmic blasphemy. The demiurge creates angels and archons, cosmic administrators, who enforce the illusion of physical reality. Time, flesh, death. These aren't natural states, they're tools of containment. In the Gospel of Judas, Jesus explains this system to Judas in a series of strange visions and dialogues. He reveals that the God worshipped by the other disciples is not the true God. Their prayers and sacrifices are misdirected. Their temples are empty. Only Judas sees the deeper architecture. One vision stands out. Judas sees a great house, and within it, people offering sacrifices. Jesus tells him that this house is not where he belongs. It is the domain of the corrupt generations bound to the archons. Judas will exceed them, but the cost will be severe. He will be hated, cursed, and replaced. But he will understand. This cosmology reframes every part of the Passion story. The crucifixion is no longer a tragedy to be mourned or a price to be paid. It is a jailbreak. The man Jesus, the body, the illusion, is sacrificed. The divine essence returns home. And Judas, he is the agent who opens the door. There's an obscure but telling reference in the text, where Jesus says, "You will not ascend with the others." It sounds damning until you remember in Gnostic cosmology, ascension through the layers of heaven is not a reward, but a path through traps. Each level is guarded by powers who demand passwords, offerings, or illusions. to escape entirely, to bypass the system that is the true victory. So when Jesus says Judas will not ascend with the others, it may be a mark of singular liberation, a sign that he will not just pass through the stars, he will transcend them. Compare this to the canonical worldview: one life, one judgment, one heaven. The Gospel of Judas offers a terrifying alternative, a universe filled with gods who don't know they aren't God, a layered cage elegantly constructed, and a narrow secret way out available only to those who receive the hidden teachings. This is not a comforting vision, but it is a powerful one. It also explains why the gospel had to be buried. This cosmology doesn't allow for universal salvation. It rejects institutional power. It deconstructs the central narrative of sin and redemption. If Jesus was never interested in saving everyone, if his death was not a ransom but an exit, then the entire edifice of the church, its sacraments, its authority, its monopoly on truth, begins to feel like one more level of illusion. And in this system, Judas isn't a traitor. He's a technician, a necessary function. The one who understands that escape requires rupture, that to free the divine spark, you must shatter the shell. This cosmology also explains the text's tone. It is cold, distant. There is little warmth in the dialogue between Jesus and Judas. No weeping, no pleas, just clarity, painful, devastating clarity. In this gospel, knowledge is not a comfort, it's a blade. It recalls the silence that haunts Judas in every telling, the sense that he carried something no one else could bear, that he understood the cost of waking up and paid it. And so for those willing to entertain the gospel's cosmology, the question shifts: was Judas cursed for betraying Jesus, or for learning too much? In the Gnostic view, that question isn't a flaw. It's the beginning of insight. Because in a world built on illusion, even betrayal may be a kind of truth. It's a question that in Orthodox Christianity doesn't even feel like a question. Of course, Jesus had to die. It's the cornerstone, the axis on which the entire theology spins. The lamb, the cross, the blood, the redemption. It all hinges on the idea that his death was a divine necessity, not a tragic accident, not a contingency plan, a sacrifice, planned, willed, and salvific. But in the Gospel of Judas and in the cosmology it belongs to, that certainty begins to unravel. What if Jesus didn't come to die for humanity? What if he came to leave it? Gnostic theology doesn't view the crucifixion as payment for sin. There's no cosmic ledger being balanced, no wrathful deity demanding satisfaction. Instead, it sees death, or rather the abandonment of the physical body, as escape. The crucifixion becomes not an offering, but an exit. Not a debt paid, but a prison door forced open. This reframes the passion narrative into something radically different. In the canonical Gospels, Jesus' death is followed by resurrection and triumph. The body rises. The wounds remain as proof, but the tomb is empty. It affirms that the material world, though broken, is redeemable, that the body matters, that death can be reversed. But in the Gospel of Judas, the resurrection doesn't appear, not even as rumor. Jesus is entirely concerned with shedding the man that clothes me. The flesh is not to be resurrected, it is to be left behind. In this vision, Jesus needs to die, but not for us, for himself, to escape the constraints of embodiment, to return to the divine fullness, the pleroma beyond the reach of the archons. Judas's role, then, is not to doom him, but to assist. This interpretation is deeply unsettling because it cuts directly across the emotional spine of Christian faith. If Jesus didn't die for you, then what is his death to you? If the cross wasn't a redemptive act, but a mechanism of transcendence, a sort of spiritual slingshot, then salvation becomes a far more lonely endeavor. And yet this alternative view opens space for different kinds of questions. What if Jesus' mission was to awaken, not atone, to teach, not bleed? There's an obscure passage in the second treatise of the great Seth, another Gnostic text where the divine Christ says of the crucifixion, "It was another their father who drank the gall and the vinegar. It was another who bore the cross on his shoulder. And I was rejoicing in the height over all the riches of the archons." In this view, the Christ never truly suffers. It is the shell, the outer illusion of body that is crucified. The inner divine self is never touched. The Gospel of Judas never goes quite that far. But the idea is similar. Jesus separates himself from the material world. His death is not an act of empathy or punishment. It is a strategy, and Judas is the one who executes it. This also deepens the emotional isolation of Judas's character. In the canonical narrative, Judas is the one who breaks faith. In this one, he fulfills it, but in doing so, he cuts himself off from every other disciple. His obedience makes him alone. No one else sees what he sees. No one else understands what Jesus asked him to do. And this calls back to the Gnostic theme of gnosis, the secret knowledge. Salvation is not for all. It is not achieved through communal worship or moral behavior. It is individual. It is earned through insight, through rupture. But if Jesus didn't need to die for our sins, what becomes of sin? Is it even real, or is it like the body part of the illusion? The Gnostics would say, sin is not a matter of breaking divine law. It's a matter of forgetting who you are. You are not fallen, you are asleep. You are not wicked, you are trapped. And Jesus in this view didn't come to wash you clean. He came to shake you awake. That doesn't mean his death was meaningless. Quite the opposite. But it reassigns its significance. It was not a substitution. It was a signal. Proof that the spark of divinity can escape the mud. And yet, the violence of the act remains. The Gospel of Judas does not shy away from the cost. Jesus knows what Judas must do. Judas knows what he will be remembered for. There is no comfort between them, no warmth, just necessity. This opens a final devastating possibility that Jesus did need to die, but not for divine reasons, for narrative ones. That the only way to break the spell of the world was to let it turn on him. That the crucifixion wasn't about cleansing humanity, but about revealing it. And in that light, Judas becomes not just a participant, but a symbol, not of betrayal, but of the terrible price of seeing clearly. Because if you glimpse the truth, if you understand what must happen, you may find yourself doing the unthinkable. Not because you want to, but because someone had to. It's a strange reversal to even consider that Judas Iscariot, the disciple synonymous with betrayal, might in fact be Christianity's first martyr. But if we accept the logic of the Gospel of Judas, that isn't a provocative theory. It's almost inevitable. Martyrdom in its earliest Christian sense was not merely about death. It was about death in service of divine will. Dying for the truth. Dying because you would not deny what you knew, what you saw, or what you believed. In this light, Judas doesn't just qualify. He surpasses the definition. He dies with full knowledge of what the others don't yet understand. He accepts eternal condemnation by men so that a divine plan might unfold, a plan he was chosen for. A plan only he was ever told. The canonical tradition gives us Judas dying by suicide often portrayed as a final act of despair and guilt. Matthew's Gospel says he threw the silver back at the priests and hanged himself. Acts awkwardly gives us a different image entirely. A field, a fall, his body bursting open. Either way, the message is clear. Judas's end is shameful, grotesque, a warning. But the Gospel of Judas doesn't describe his death at all. It ends before it. All we are told is that he sees a vision of his own coming sacrifice, that he will be cursed by the other generations, that he will suffer, that he will not be remembered kindly. There is no rope, no field, just fate. This omission might be more powerful than a description. It leaves a space and absence where a martyr's story might go, a void filled by possibility. Judas in this vision is not cowardly, he is brave. He does not fall, he steps forward. The horror lies not in his actions, but in what they cost him. He gives up his name, his reputation, his legacy, all so that Jesus might ascend, all so that the flesh might be shed. In a way, this version of Judas is more Christ-like than many would dare admit. He is misunderstood, reviled, abandoned, and above all, obedient to something no one else can see. And here's the haunting echo: Jesus knows what it will cost him. He tells Judas plainly that he will be hated for generations, that people will never understand, that his name will become a stain. And still, he says, you will exceed them all, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me. It's not flattery, it's commissioning. If Jesus' crucifixion is the ultimate act of spiritual obedience, then Judas's betrayal in this telling is its mirror. He too obeys. He too suffers. But where Jesus ascends, Judas vanishes. One is glorified, the other erased. And that imbalance is what gives the theory its tragic beauty. Because Judas never gets to explain himself, never gets to testify. His voice is silenced before he can speak. All we have are these fragments, a damaged codex buried in a cave, and the suggestion that the greatest villain of the New Testament was in fact its most loyal disciple. This reversal taps into something deeper than theology. It touches the human ache for misjudged figures, for the condemned who were right, for those who bore the burden so others could be free. And it's worth noting that the earliest Christian martyrs weren't called saints. They were called witnesses. That's what martyr means, a witness. Someone who saw and refused to deny. Someone who paid with their life to confirm what they had seen. In the Gospel of Judas, Judas is shown the cosmos, the realms of angels, the fate of the other disciples. He sees Jesus in his true form, not as a man, but as radiant light. He knows, and knowing he acts. He doesn't write epistles, he doesn't found churches, he doesn't even try to defend himself. He simply goes to the priests and delivers Jesus into their hands, not because he wants to, but because he must. And then the curtain falls. So perhaps it's not Judas's betrayal we fear most. Perhaps what unsettles us is the idea that someone could be both damned and divine. That the first martyr might not have died for Christ, but because Christ asked him to. It shatters the clean moral binary. It blurs hero and traitor. And in doing so, it invites us to look again at every story we thought we understood. The story of Judas then becomes not just a footnote in the passion narrative. It becomes its dark twin, the price of revelation, the martyrdom without the martyrdom. And that kind of sacrifice might be the hardest of all to recognize. It was inevitable, really. The moment the Gospel of Judas re-emerged from its crypt of sand and rot, the modern Christian world stirred not with immediate outrage, but with something more complicated, suspicion wrapped in curiosity, disbelief trailing behind fascination. For nearly 2 millennia, Judas had been theological shorthand for treachery, the betrayer's name invoked as a warning, a shadow. And suddenly, here was a text, not only softening his image, but exalting him, suggesting that the church's most despised figure might have been all along the most faithful. The institutional reactions arrived with practiced caution. The Vatican issued a statement acknowledging the Gospel's historical interest, but warned believers not to take it as truth. It was, they said, a product of heretical thinking, an echo of Gnostic distortions that had long been condemned. There was no shift in dogma, no reappraisal of Judas's role. The betrayal remained a betrayal. Still, the mere publication of the Gospel was enough to unsettle the margins. Christian scholars and theologians, some with church blessing, others decidedly without, began to weigh in. Some dismissed the Gospel as nonsense, a second-century fantasy with no bearing on real events. Others argued that even if it was Gnostic, even if it was allegorical or metaphorical, it revealed something vital about the diversity of early Christian thought and about how much of it had been forcefully silenced. Theologians of a more progressive bent saw in the Gospel of Judas a reminder that early Christianity was never a monolith, that the canon we know today was not handed down whole from heaven, but assembled through politics, councils, and sometimes coercion. They pointed to the many Gospels once circulating in the first few centuries of Mary Thomas Philip. All voices now silenced, and asked the uncomfortable question, what if the truth about Jesus was not a single linear story, but a spectrum? Some Christian thinkers even expressed cautious sympathy for Judas. If he had acted at Jesus' request, as the Gospel suggests, then his role was not evil, but essential. If there had been no betrayal, there would have been no crucifixion, no resurrection, no salvation. In that light, Judas is not the villain of the story. He is the hinge. Among lay believers, reactions varied even more widely. For some, the Gospel was little more than a curiosity, something strange but irrelevant, like the Gospel of Peter or the apocryphal infancy Gospels. For others, it was offensive, a slap in the face to centuries of teaching and tradition. And for a few, it was liberating, a crack in the edifice of inherited truth, an opening to reevaluate what they'd always been told. That last group is small but vocal. You can find their discussions in academic forums, interfaith dialogues, and online spaces where belief and doubt coexist uneasily. They ask whether Christianity can hold space for ambiguity, whether the faith is strong enough to absorb new or very old revelations without unraveling. And of course, there's the inevitable media swirl. When National Geographic published its translation and aired its documentary in 2006, headlines exploded with phrases like Judas redeemed and the lost gospel. Talk shows and think pieces debated whether this changed everything or nothing. Was this a spiritual revolution or just a historical footnote? The answer, as usual, depends on who you ask. Conservative apologists maintain that the Gospel of Judas is a Gnostic curiosity disconnected from Jesus' real teachings. They argue that Gnosticism, with its dualistic view of spirit versus matter and its rejection of the material world, is fundamentally incompatible with Christian theology. And they're right in a way. The Gospel of Judas doesn't fit comfortably within orthodoxy. It doesn't try to. But for others, the Gospel's very strangeness is its value. Its dissonance forces us to hear the early Christian chorus, not as a solo, but as a polyphony, many voices, many visions, some harmonious, some jarring. And Judas, long seen as the dissonant note, suddenly sings a different melody. Even outside religious circles, the Gospel has inspired artists, poets, and philosophers. The idea of a man sacrificing his reputation, enduring hatred and erasure for a higher cause, all in silence, is irresistible. It echoes themes of misunderstood nobility, the cost of truth, the price of obedience. In literature, in film, and whispered speculation, Judas has become something else, a symbol of the unseen martyr, the necessary villain. There's a quiet irony to this entire reaction cycle. For centuries, Judas was seen as irredeemable, a warning, a curse. But now, with the unearthing of this single codex, he's become a mirror. How one responds to the Gospel of Judas often reveals more about the reader than about the text. Do you cling to the comfort of certainty, or do you find meaning in the murk that tension is unlikely to resolve? The Gospel of Judas won't be added to the Bible. It won't replace Sunday sermons. But its presence is a crack in the glass, a reminder that history is not a sealed vault, that even the most reviled figures might have stories we never heard, and that perhaps, just perhaps, the line between villain and saint is thinner than we'd like to admit. You're standing at the threshold of a man's name that has for nearly 2,000 years been synonymous with betrayal. But step a little closer, and it becomes harder to define him so cleanly. Judas Iscariot isn't just a figure in a book. He's a psychological archetype, a cultural imprint, a moral shorthand. And now, as the gospel that bears his name whispers a different story, we're left with a far more difficult figure, not the simple traitor, but the complex man. One who may have acted from conviction or fear or love or all three. It's no accident that Judas evokes such visceral reactions. To call someone a Judas is to level the most intimate of accusations, betrayal not from an enemy, but from within. The sting comes not from the act itself, but from the closeness of the bond that preceded it. We don't say Judas when a stranger wrongs us. We reserve that name for someone who once stood beside us. So what happens when that image starts to shift? When the villain of the Passion narrative might have been following orders, sacred, divine ones? What if the betrayal was obedience? And what does that mean, not just for theology, but for the way we process guilt, loyalty, and moral ambiguity? In modern psychology, there's a term called cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort that arises when a person holds two contradictory beliefs or values at the same time. That's precisely the dissonance that believers and skeptics alike face when confronting this version of Judas. The Gospel tells us he acted with Jesus' knowledge, maybe even with his blessing. Yet we've been taught since childhood that Judas is the villain, the one who chose silver over loyalty, the one who kissed Jesus and doomed him. But what if the kiss was a farewell? What if the silver meant nothing or was given to fulfill prophecy, not out of greed? The weight of that dissonance causes a split. Some push back immediately. The traditional story is cleaner, emotionally satisfying. It preserves Jesus as hero, Judas as betrayer, and the rest of us comfortably distant from both. But for others, the fracture invites introspection. Because if Judas believed he was doing the right thing and still became the villain, then who among us is safe from misjudgment, from history's distortion? There's something deeply human in that, the fear of being misunderstood forever. Some theologians have proposed that Judas's suicide reported in the canonical Gospels was not a final act of shame, but one of despair, or perhaps grief. Not over guilt, but over the unbearable burden of having played a role no one would understand. A scapegoat stripped of context. If you believe the Gnostic narrative, Judas gave up not only his life, but his legacy, knowing he'd be hated by all who came after. That's not just betrayal. That's a kind of martyrdom. And of course, psychology asks the deeper question: what would compel a man to accept that role? It's possible Judas saw something in Jesus the others didn't. Maybe he grasped the danger they were in, that the tide of Roman power and local unrest could only be answered with a sacrifice. Maybe he thought Jesus' message couldn't survive unless it was sealed in blood. Or maybe, like all humans tangled in faith and fear, he simply couldn't bear the uncertainty anymore. Perhaps betrayal was in his mind the only way forward. What's fascinating is how different cultures interpret Judas. In the medieval period, artists painted him with a grotesque face, sometimes with red hair, a visual marker of treachery. In Dante's Inferno, he's in the lowest circle of hell, chewed eternally in Satan's jaws. But modern depictions have softened. In literature, film, even rock operas, Judas appears conflicted, tragic, almost sympathetic. The psychology has crept back in. It mirrors a broader cultural shift from rigid moral binaries to an embrace of ambiguity. Today's audiences are drawn to anti-heroes, flawed protagonists, morally gray figures who challenge simple narratives. The Gospel of Judas, whether ancient or not, taps directly into that appetite. It asks us not to excuse Judas, but to understand him, to sit with the discomfort of a man who may have been both faithful and doomed. This is why Judas endures, not just as a name, but as a question. If Judas acted from love, what does that mean for betrayal? If he was following divine command, what does that mean for free will? If his fate was sealed before he chose it, what does that say about justice? You might remember the earlier vision of Jesus in the Gospel of Judas laughing at the other disciples. A secret knowledge shared only with Judas. A cosmic stage on which flesh must fall away to free the divine spark. In that context, Judas isn't a traitor. He's a participant in a celestial drama, a necessary player. And yet outside the pages of that gospel, we are left with silence. No writings from Judas survive, no confession, no defense, just the echoes of others and a name that became a wound. So we project. We imagine his motives. We argue over his guilt. We wonder whether, if placed in his sandals, we would have done the same or worse. That's the psychological power of Judas. Not that he betrayed Jesus, but that he invites us to wonder, what if we've betrayed our own truths? What if we're wrong about the stories we tell? And how far would we go to protect the people or the gods we love? You sit now in a strange quiet, the kind that comes after the upheaval. After centuries of condemnation, after the buried parchment, after all the sermons and statues and paintings that taught you who Judas was, there remains this gospel. Fragile, incomplete, yet impossible to ignore. The gospel of Judas doesn't shout. It doesn't demand belief. It whispers. And in that whisper is something strangely contemporary. In our age, an era saturated with moral revisionism, re-examinations of villains, and the questioning of long-trusted institutions, the story of Judas feels less like a relic and more like a reflection. We live in a world that's constantly flipping its heroes and enemies, revealing hidden motives, and asking whether the stories we were told were ever fully true. The Gospel of Judas fits into this world seamlessly, a forgotten text, stepping out of the desert and into a society eager to rethink everything. In the 21st century, reappraisal is its own kind of ritual. Statues come down. Historical figures are reassessed. Old heroes are found to be complicated. Old villains misunderstood. Even the concept of truth has splintered into perspectives. And here amidst that flux arrives a text that says maybe the greatest traitor in history wasn't one at all. The implications are both thrilling and unsettling. Because if Judas wasn't the villain, then every version of Christianity built on that premise has a hole in its foundation. That doesn't mean collapse, but it does mean renovation, rethinking, peeling back layers. That's a process some believers resist, understandably. The comfort of certainty is hard to give up, but others lean in curious to see what faith looks like after it's passed through fire. In many ways, this gospel's survival is a miracle of its own. It could have turned to dust. It could have stayed hidden in that cave forever, or been destroyed during centuries of conquest and censorship. But it didn't. It surfaced at a time when people were ready, or at least more willing to listen. Not necessarily to accept, but to consider. And it's not just scholars and theologians who find themselves drawn in. Artists, writers, filmmakers, they've all begun weaving this alternate Judas into modern mythologies. A Judas who loved too much, who obeyed too far, who bore a burden no one else could. There's something profoundly human in that shift. It mirrors our growing recognition that good and evil are not always cleanly divided. That intention matters. That context counts. The black and white narratives of old don't hold up so well under the soft, persistent light of empathy. And yet the gospel isn't trying to make Judas a saint. It doesn't offer a redemption arc in the traditional sense. There's no absolution, no happy ending. Just a different view, one that leaves room for sorrow, complexity, and perhaps even grace. It's not an erasure of guilt. It's an expansion of possibility. You've seen this pattern before. In literature, in politics, in public memory. The misunderstood figure who returns from exile not to rewrite history, but to remind us it was never fully written. Judas in this telling becomes less a character and more a mirror. A way for us to examine ourselves, our loyalties, our betrayals, our hungers for truth, and our discomfort with ambiguity. The Gospel of Judas doesn't demand that we believe it. It doesn't shout its truth. Instead, it lingers in the silence between other voices, in the gaps between verses, in the breath before the kiss. And that restraint, that refusal to shout, makes it all the more powerful in an age of noise. You may recall how this gospel's cosmology turned everything upside down: angels as jailers, materiality as a trap, death as release. That inversion echoes how our own understanding of stories has begun to invert. Villains are being reread, narratives reshelved. Judas, too, is changing categories. It's possible this gospel was never meant for the masses. The text itself says Jesus shared these teachings with Judas alone. Not with Peter, not with James, not with the crowds. Just one man, the one who would become reviled. The Gnostics were never interested in broad appeal. They believed in hidden knowledge, difficult truths, and salvation not through belief, but through awakening. And isn't that exactly what this gospel has done? Not given us an answer, but disturbed our comfort. Not offered peace, but provoked a question. What if the gospel of Judas survived not because it was right or divine, but because we still need it? Because even now we are learning how to look at our own betrayals, our own failures, our own desperate bargains, and ask what they really meant. It may be too late to clear Judas's name. His place in popular imagination is too deep, too enduring. But perhaps it's not about vindication. Perhaps it's about listening, not just to the gospel's words, but to the spaces it opens, the kind of spaces where doubt becomes not a threat to faith, but a sign that faith is still alive. And in that way, the gospel of Judas may be less about Judas and more about us. You've come a long way through the shadows of this story. You've held fragments of parchment once thought lost to time. You've watched the familiar figure of Judas shift and blur, refusing to stay still beneath the labels history gave him. And now here you find yourself staring at the edge of the most unsettling possibility. Yet what if the betrayal never happened? Not the kiss, of course. That moment in the garden where torchlight flickers off metal and sleep is shaken from the eyes of the faithful still stands. But the meaning of it changes everything. What if that kiss wasn't treason but obedience, not deception but courage? What if Judas was not acting against Jesus but for him, The Gospel of Judas doesn't just suggest that Judas knew more than the others. It insists on it. Over and over, the text portrays him as the only disciple who truly understands Jesus' mission, not as a political revolution, but a metaphysical release. The others fumble with literalism, with altars and sacrifices and earthly kingdoms. Judas alone is invited into the quiet places, the strange revelations, the secret knowledge. The phrase that echoes "you will sacrifice the man that clothes me" begins to make more sense now. If Jesus' true self is not of this world, then his body, his flesh, is a garment. Judas isn't ending a life. He's peeling away the fabric, releasing something divine trapped within. In that light, the crucifixion becomes less a tragedy and more a ritual, a planned transformation. And Judas is not the traitor, but the hand that sets it in motion. What's more astonishing is how tightly this reframing aligns with certain strains of early Christian mysticism, the kind that never made it into the creeds or catechisms. There were always whispers, always groups who saw the crucifixion not as punishment, but as transcendence. The body as prison, the world as illusion. And suddenly, Judas doesn't seem like a failure of faith. He looks like a necessary part of a cosmic plan. Of course, this vision is dangerous. It strips away the clear lines of blame. If Judas was following divine instructions, then the centuries of hatred, the sermons, the slurs, the art that shows him snarling in shadow, become not just inaccurate, but cruel. And the early church, which needed Judas to carry the weight of betrayal, begins to look like it was preserving not truth, but narrative control. But maybe the Gospel of Judas isn't asking you to forgive him. Maybe it's not even asking you to believe him. Maybe it's asking a deeper question about what we call betrayal and who gets to decide. Because betrayal is always about perspective. To the priests, Judas did a righteous thing. To the Romans, he was useful. To the early church, he was the fall guy who made Jesus a martyr. To the Gnostics, he was a chosen one. And to Jesus, in this strange, haunting gospel, he might have been something like a friend. One who did the terrible thing because he was asked. One who bore the weight no one else could. You begin to realize with a kind of sleepy unease that this version of Judas might not be more comforting, only more complicated. In the old story at least, you knew who the villain was. You knew who to blame. But now you're left with something more fragile. The idea that what we've condemned for 2,000 years might have been a kind of love. It doesn't mean the canonical Gospels are false. It doesn't mean the Gospel of Judas is true. But it does mean that history, like faith, is rarely simple. The real betrayal might not be what Judas did, but what we did to his memory. We needed someone to carry the sin. We needed a monster. And Judas, isolated, reviled, dead by his own hand, was easy to cast. But monsters don't usually cry. They don't usually kiss. They don't usually obey a whisper from a friend who says, "Do what you came to do." And so this is where we are. At the edge of a story we thought we knew. With a gospel we almost lost. And with a man we still can't decide whether to damn or to mourn. Maybe that's the point. You linger now in the hush that follows revelation. Not the blare of certainty or the clang of resolved debate, but the softer, heavier quiet of something nearly understood. The story of Judas has been pulled apart, reassembled, and reimagined. And still something lingers just beyond the reach of language, a shadow in the text, a silence beneath the sand. You picture it again, that crumbling cave in the Egyptian desert, dry wind tracing ridges of time across the rocks. The codex lay buried there for centuries, not guarded, not hidden in some grand chamber, just waiting, covered in dust, ink fading, Leather stiffened and cracked, as if the world had forgotten it was ever meant to speak. And yet it survived. Not by accident, not by chance. Someone long ago thought it mattered enough to protect. They wrapped it, they sealed it, they tucked it away from the fires of orthodoxy and the swords of imperial certainty. They didn't know who would find it, or when, only that it must be preserved. Because sometimes the most dangerous truths are the ones too fragile to shout. You wonder now what else might lie buried. What other pages sleep beneath forgotten floors, waiting to shift the way we see not just history, but ourselves. The Gospel of Judas might be singular, or it might be a fragment of a larger hidden library, one that dared to ask strange questions, one that told stories not of sin and punishment, but of knowledge and strange grace. It's a comforting thought in a quiet way, that somewhere in the silence more voices are still resting, that the story isn't over, just incomplete. And maybe that's all history ever is. Now the sands settle again. The light fades gently from the sky. You've heard the questions. You've held them up to the flicker of what might be true. And whether you believe or not, whether you forgive or not, one thing lingers long after the last word is spoken. Some truths don't need to shout to survive. They just need to be heard. Once. And now you have. Sleep well.